This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
So within OPUS, as Peter mentioned earlier this morning, there are four main streams of research. And I co-lead one of those streams of research with Tony Scott, who's from the Institute of Economics and Social Research, Melbourne Institute of Economics and Social Research. So the objective of Work Plan 2 is to really try and design and test behavioural interventions targeting both patients and clinicians to try and support and drive evidence-based decision-making. We use a range of methodologies in this stream of research. A lot of qualitative research is done, quantitative research and economics. We actually have three main trials at various stages in Work Plan 2. The most recent trial is the PRETEND trial. We have a partnership project underway, and we also have the MARKA study. The MARKA study actually predates the CRE, but it was one of the main studies that actually informed our CRE application and is furthest along in maturity. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the first two studies, just what they're about, because obviously they're just being launched and we don't have results yet. And then I'm going to hand over to a colleague of mine who's been working very hard on the MARKA study, and she'll have some, hopefully some novel insights into what's arising from that study. So just to start, the PRETEND trial, it's quite a novel study. It's a mixed method study to evaluate the preferences, feasibility and costs of performing sham surgery in orthopaedic procedures, but particularly we're looking at major orthopaedic procedures. It's an NHMRC funded study. It's only a 2-year study, and it's just starting this year. And we know, as it's already been mentioned, there's more than 100,000 Australians undergoing joint replacement surgery each year at quite a large cost. But really there aren't any sham trials that have been conducted to actually test the efficacy of joint replacement or other major orthopaedic surgical procedures. We know that there have been some sham trials performed in more minor orthopaedic procedures, and in fact Sam Bunsley, who leads this research project, has undertaken a systematic review. And what we found from that systematic review, we identified 10 sham surgery trials that have been published in orthopaedics, but we also identified 12 trials that have actually never been published because for one reason or another they've not been completed. When we look at the studies in terms of risk of bias assessment, there was only one study that had low risk of bias, and 9 out of the 10 trials actually had issues or ethical issues in terms if you applied an ethical assessment or framework. But obviously they all actually were given ethics approval before starting. So it just highlights some of the complexities and difficulties of actually conducting sham surgery trials. So the PRETEND trial uses qualitative research to actually inform the development of a discrete choice experiment that we hope will identify the conditions under which patients with osteoarthritis undergoing joint replacement surgery and orthopaedic surgeons are willing to participate if they were asked to enrol their patients in a sham surgery trial. We want to use health economic modelling to develop a framework for the feasibility and costs associated with sham trials, and we hope that we'll be able to develop a template for future use in terms of assessing the feasibility of clinical trials. As I mentioned earlier, this particular trial is led by one of our early career postdoctoral researchers, Samantha Bunsley, and we have formed a new collaboration with Francesco Paolucci, who is a behavioural economist from Newcastle University. We have a wonderful study coordinator on this project, And we're at the point of ethics submission, and I think it's just being submitted this coming week. So it's a very novel study, and I'm sure it's going to provide some very interesting insights into the world of sham trials. The second major study that we've got running in Stream 2 is a partnership project, and it's all about closing the evidence to practice gap in total knee replacement by optimising evidence-based decision-making through the use of a multi-dimensional surgeon feedback intervention. It's an NHMRC partnership project, and our partners on this are St Vincent's Health Australia, Medibank, Musculoskeletal Australia, and the Australian Orthopaedic Association. And it's all prefaced around this reported 1/4 of patients who appear to be inappropriate candidates for joint replacement surgery according to evidence-based criteria. And we know that in that 1/4, when you apply the criteria, that they often, those that are inappropriate, do not do as well from joint replacement surgery. So the methodology for this study, it's a step-wedged cluster randomised controlled trial. We have nested qualitative evaluations and a health economic evaluation as well embedded in the process. And we really want to evaluate the efficacy of this multi-dimensional feedback intervention on improving patient pain and function outcomes, and also obviously adherence to evidence-based criteria. It will be implemented initially across 9 private and public hospitals in the St Vincent's Health Australia network. The actual feedback intervention itself, it's electronic. It contains a prognostic nomogram that we developed back in 2016, which can give you a predictive probability of poor response to total knee replacement surgery. So that forms part of the what we call the SMART tool, this feedback intervention. But it also includes, based on the outcomes of the nomogram, what other options aside from surgery might be suitable for a patient. So the nomogram drills down into those, what's driving this potential poor response for surgery. So if it's a weight issue or it's early OA, then automatically options, evidence-based options, non-surgery options will pop up with links and so forth. But the third element of our SMART tool is that it provides live feedback to surgeons who opt into using this about the outcomes of their patients after surgery. And that'll obviously occur once there's enough evidence or enough cases in the actual tool that we can provide de-identified information. And there will be an opportunity for surgeons to benchmark against their colleagues. And it will also provide them other detail around length of stay, complication rates, etc. So we have a very large team working on the partnership project, a number of collaborations, University of Sydney, we've got Medibank, a chief investigator from Medibank on the grant, we've got implementation scientists, health economists, biostatisticians, and we have a wonderful study coordinator, Claire Whedon, who has worked diligently over the past 12 months to get the SMART tool to a point where we can have it embedded into the St Vincent's Health local intranet. So the progress with this study it's been a complex process to get the SMART tool onto the hospital server, but it's finalised, and we think we'll be able to launch the SMART tool in May. And so the third study that we're undertaking in our stream is the MARKA study, and I'm going to introduce Sandie to the podium, who's going to give you a bit of background to what the MARKA study is, and she's been working very hard on analysing, and she's going to provide some preliminary data from our initial analysis of this trial. So thanks, Sandie.
Hello.
It's just a to the right to move forward.
Perfect. Right, so my name's Sandie. I used to be the study coordinator at St Vincent's Hospital for Michelle, and I've now gone over to the dark side, and I'm working with Tony at the Melbourne Institute, kind of analysing all the data. So MARKA, which is the maximum acceptable risk in knee arthroplasty, obviously not as catchy, aims to kind of look at how patients and surgeons balance their risk preferences, how they trade off risk for improvements in health. So we used a discrete choice experiment to look at these risks, which I'll go into in a couple of slides and have a look at. It's an NMHRC funded project which started in 2015 and is wrapping up at the end of this year. So it's been a long haul, but it's all very exciting now it's getting to the end. And one of the drivers behind this project is the fact that obviously about 30% of people are unhappy with their knee replacement. So we just want to work out why, and understanding whether or not that might be the fact they've got high expectations of their knee replacement, and maybe looking at different options to reducing those expectations and making them more realistic is a good thing. So, to do this, we administered a DCE to about 350 orthopaedic surgeons and patients. So surgeons were contacted via email and mail across Australia, and patients were approached in their pre-admission clinic before their knee operation. We did this embedded within a survey, so we also looked at personality traits, so optimism and confidence and their risk aversion, and also level of experience and practice patterns. And for patients, we also looked at personality traits, but then we also asked questions about their expectations of the outcome of knee replacement after 12 months. Within this trial, we had a randomised control trial, so we used the DCE as an intervention to see whether or not that changed their expectations of their knee replacement. So giving them more information, does that reduce what they think the outcome is going to be? So we've got a great team, lots and lots of people. I still sit in meetings 2 years later and understand about 30% of what's being spoken about, but that's great. So obviously Michelle, we've got Peter, Tony, Vijaya and Mandy, and then myself, Jinhu and Liz, who were involved in the study coordinator role and the analysis of the data. In terms of the process, the surgeon survey's all been collected, so we've collected all that data, run the analysis, it's all in paper form and with a journal at the moment waiting to be reviewed. The RCT finished last October and we're having a year follow-up, so that will finish this October. And we're hoping to complete the patient arm by the end of this month, so fingers crossed. So we've spoken a bit about DCEs, and this is an example of one that we gave to surgeons. For our trial, we were looking specifically at 6 different attributes. Pain being one of them, so daytime and nighttime pain. Function, so function moving, function standing. And then we were also looking at 2 different types of risk. So risk of reoperation and risk of going back to see your GP for any other complication. So what we did is we presented this DCE, or one similar, to both surgeons and patients, and basically asked them to choose which outcome they would prefer. So the different attributes varied with the different levels, and we asked them to choose which one they liked most. And it's obviously very, very difficult, and we gave them the option afterwards, if they didn't like either of those outcomes, 12 months after the surgery, would they still have that operation? So it gave them an option to opt out afterwards. And collecting all this data meant that we could work out what the marginal rate of substitution is. And what that really means to us is how much additional risk is equivalent to an improvement in health. So we were looking at improvements of, say, daytime pain. We're looking at severe to no daytime pain, or severe to moderate daytime pain. And we just want to work out how much people value that improvement and how much risk they're willing to accept. So like I said, we've collected all the surgeon DC results, and this is what we've got. I put it in a little neat and tidy diagram. So along the y-axis, we've got our different attributes, and we're comparing each of the attributes to the severe level that they've got. So for example, the first top 2 would be no daytime pain and moderate daytime pain, and we're comparing both of those to severe daytime pain. And then along the x-axis, we're looking at how much risk they're willing to accept to move between those levels and attributes. So I guess the most obvious thing that you can see from that diagram is the blue dots are further on the right-hand side. Is that the right view? On the right-hand side, which basically means that surgeons are willing to accept higher risk of going to see your GP again or seeing a specialist again for every single movement or every single health improvement than the risk of reoperation. which is kind of to be expected. We know that going back and having another operation is far more serious than having to go see your GP for something. What's the most interesting thing about this is it a little red dot? Oh, there you go. So in terms of both of them, they're all basically in the same order, so they value each thing similarly. But we can tell that from how far along they are, how much risk they're willing to take. So we know here that in terms of how much risk a surgeon is willing to accept for an improvement in health, how much risk a surgeon is willing to accept for an improvement in health. They're willing to accept the highest risk of moving from, severe nighttime pain to no nighttime pain. So this one here. And that's for both of them. So both risk of reoperation and risk of GP visits. So that tells us that nighttime pain is the most important attribute to surgeons when they're looking at if someone is going to go ahead with a knee replacement. And then out of them all, the least important one is moderate difficulty moving. So they're willing to accept the lowest amount of risk out of all of them for a patient to move from severe difficulty in moving, so standing, sitting, walking, for a risk of reoperation for both of them. So we've done some preliminary results for the patients. I think we've got, well, this one's about 267 patients out of the 300 that we're targeting. So they look pretty similar. In terms of patients are also willing to accept higher risks of going to see a GP over risk of reoperation for every health improvement. They kind of have got a bit more variation, which you'd probably expect as well. So if I stick them both next to each other, you can kind of look at them and compare them. So what we want to know, especially in the shared decision of surgery, is are patients and surgeons' expectations aligned? Are we doing the right thing? Do we have the same ideas? And what you can tell from this is they might look similar, because it's diagram, but they're not. Function is much lower, so surgeons are willing to accept a lower risk of are willing to accept a much lower risk of reoperation to improve function than patients, so they probably think it's a bit more important. And also a key thing to take away is, I was saying earlier that surgeons are willing to accept the highest risk for moving from severe nighttime pain to no nighttime pain, but for patients, actually they care about the daytime pain far more. So that's the most important thing for them. And what we really need to ask ourselves now is, these differences do exist, but do they matter? Are they statistically significant? And what we find is that surgeons do actually value improvements in nighttime pain more and improvements in the ability to move less than patients. And that's what we found so far. So there are different risk preferences, and it's kind of just working out what that means. How do we align them? Overall, surgeons and patients are willing to accept a higher risk of new visits to see a GP instead of a risk of reoperation, which is, again, pretty intuitive. We also asked the questions about surgeons' personalities and patients' personalities, and we've not had the chance to look at the analysis for the patients, but we know for a fact that surgeons' personality characteristics don't actually influence their willingness to accept risk in surgery. So, yeah. Anyone's got any questions?
Fantastic. It's good to have a tag team. Any questions for either of our speakers? Richard.
Yeah, no, thank you for really informative research with the MARKA study. These patients, this discrete choice was actually done prior to surgery, wasn't it? This is what... So post-operatively, the biggest issue patients have after knee surgery is they actually have improvement in daytime pain, but they still have nighttime pain. That's probably the commonest thing with knee surgery, and certainly up to 6 months after surgery. Could you possibly repeat this in lieu of what has actually happened to the patient? Some kind of follow-up to see if those expectations were met, or would they have changed as a result of what they now know, patients?
We hadn't planned to, but within the cohort of patients that we have recruited, some are actually second-siders, so they've had a knee replacement before. So I guess it's kind of, we'll be able to do a sub-analysis to see, was there a difference for those who've experienced a knee replacement before compared to those who haven't.
Any other questions for either of our speakers? I'll let you read that.
So how do we account for patients from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds? We had interpreters, so we did actually fund interpreters for the study. However, they're challenging when someone's from a non-English speaking background. It is challenging to, in our experience, to recruit them. So although we had funding for interpreters and so forth, I don't think we got a very high rate.
No, there was a few, but...
So we have a few in the data set, but I suspect not enough to actually analyse for differences.
We've still got a couple of minutes, so I might just take the chairman's privilege and just put Michelle on the spot. Look, I think the nomogram's a great idea, and I'm just interested in its implementation. So can you just comment on where you think, in terms of the care process, this is best done, knowing full well that the levers of surgery, by the time you get to the surgeon, it may be a little bit on the late side? And is the primary target, being the clinician, optimal? Should this be something that we do in tandem and ideally target the consumer as opposed to the surgeon themselves?
So in terms of when is the best time to apply the nomogram, I think that it was designed with end-stage arthritis for people on the waiting list. That was the cohort we used, so that's the cohort it's most likely to work in. We do need to have decision aids well before people get to the end stage of arthritis, but I think we need to potentially have them all the way along the journey, and we do have some work happening within the CRE looking at that earlier time point. I agree that we do need to have decision aids that involve the patients particularly, but we know that it's that surgeons are selecting patients that don't abide by evidence-based criteria. So I think there is a lot of work being done in the space of decision-making for patients, but I don't know of any work that's necessarily targeted the clinician. And although we're doing it separately, the idea would be at some point to look at then amalgamating decision aids so that you have this one decision aid for both patients and surgeons, that they can work on it together, or clinicians in stage.